Hello, welcome to Healing with Krista. I am the host. We are on episode 2, Childhood Trauma, Part 1. Before we move forward, I wanted to mention I'm not a mental health professional and my experiences are special to me. I am sharing my story and what works for me, but it's not a substitute for professional advice or therapy. If you're struggling, please consult a qualified professional. My goal is to share hope and support, not provide guidance or solutions. Take what resonates, leave what doesn't. Always prioritize your own path to healing. Before we move forward, I must state a trigger warning. This podcast deals with mature themes, including trauma, mental health struggles, addiction, and loss. If you're sensitive to these topics or have experienced trauma, this podcast may not be suitable for you. Listener discretion is advised. If you do choose to listen, please prioritize your well being and take breaks when needed. Before we move forward, I wanted to share that I'm not here to bash my mother or blame her for any childhood trauma that me and my siblings went through when we were younger. I know that she was carrying her own trauma from what she was going through in her childhood and, her early teen years. And sometimes hurt people. And that's part of the vicious cycle that most people go through. And that's what I'm here to talk about is this cycle. I love my mom dearly, rest her soul. This podcast is about breaking that cycle through awareness, sharing my story, letting you guys know this is what I went through. This was my reality. This is my truth. And I think sharing my story and my truth is going to help other people to know that what they went through wasn't normal, but also it doesn't define who we are as a person. Just because we grew up in a shitty household does not mean that we're a shitty person or that we're going to be living in the same environment as we grew up in. This is about hope and changing the narrative for that. And that's why I think it's important that it's okay to share our childhood trauma. And it's nothing to be embarrassed of. It's the only way that we're going to heal is by sharing our truth. And that's the whole reason why I'm sharing this is because I want to spread that awareness in the Native communities, on the res and in the urban area. But I'm not here to shift blame or look for pity. I'm simply here just to um, let you guys know that there is hope. It does get better. And that's all I wanted to share with you guys. But one thing that I also wanted to share was a quote that I seen on social media. I also shared it on Facebook. But the quote goes, "Trauma stole my youth. I was busy surviving while everyone my age was living." And that hit me so hard because it's the truth. It was the reality that I was living in my youth and my childhood. A lot of the relatives and friends that I talked with was playing with Barbies, going to the movies, playing outside, just enjoying life without responsibilities. And that's how it should be. That's normal. But I grew up in a household, and I know a lot of other people have as well, where we focused on other things. Our priorities were different, a lot different. I grew up in a household where me and my sister took on the responsibility of being the second parent. We cooked for our younger siblings. We changed our siblings so they wouldn't get a diaper rash. We made their bottles, formula, and we helped even, washing them up, just doing the parental role that we shouldn't have did, but we did. And that's sort of where that early maturity came from. because that was one thing that me and my sister always got complimented on was, oh, you're so mature for your age. Or how old are you again? And we would let them know like 9 or 10. And that's not a compliment. That's not normal for a child to be mature for their age. It's not normal. I wouldn't want any other kid to take on the responsibility of having to be self aware that much because we want our youth to be able to enjoy their childhood and not have the responsibility of an adult. And I see that present day, in my surroundings. And I do see a lot of kids that are very mature for their age. And honestly, it makes me sad and it makes me think about like the things that they went through because I know what they went through and they shouldn't be worried about the things that they're worrying about. But, that's just something that a lot of the kids on the Indian reservation, that's how they grew up, is being more mature, taking on more responsibilities than they should, playing the adult role, the parental role in the family. And I just want to let everyone know like, this is not normal. This should not be anybody's reality. This is not something that we should be putting on our kids for them to be worrying about adult things. When they turn 18 and become that adult, then yeah, but nobody should carry on that burden because it does cause trauma. Um, but yeah, I just wanted to share that because reading that quote on social media really just hit me and I just related to that so much. Reading that just really made me sad for a second and gave me kind of a quick flashback um and I just know like a lot of our youth are facing that too. But moving forward, I wanted to share a quick story. I have a few stories I wanted to share, but the first story that I wanted to share with you guys was when me and my sister um, lived in Sioux City. We had our other siblings living there. So there was five of us and my mom. We had a two-bedroom apartment. And one day my mom was drinking and she said she was gonna, go drink at her friend's house. And she ended up being gone for 2 to 3 days. I can't remember how many days exactly, but during this time, I was about 9 or 10 years old, and Megan was about 10 or 11. Megan's a year older than me. But yeah, during that time, she was gone for 2 or 3 days. And I remember us cooking in the kitchen. I remember our younger siblings being hungry. And so I remember going in the kitchen at 9, 10 years old and getting the flour together, the baking powder, mixing it up, and making some biscuits. And Megan made rice and macaroni. And this is what we had for like 2, 3 days. This is all we ate. And I was talking with Megan a few days ago, and we were talking about this story. And one thing about Megan is she has a more clearer memory. Her memory is more sharper than mine. I have a really bad memory, and that just stems from childhood trauma. You block out all this negative and bad things that happen to you. And when you become an adult, it makes you more forgetful. So I just thought I would share that a little bit. But so Megan remembers us making the biscuits and the rice and macaroni, but she also remembers that we had like chicken patties or chicken tenders. So we threw those in there too. So those were all in the mix. But we had that for like 2 or 3 days. And I remember thinking like just being like proud that we could. And I remember just like eating the biscuits and like the biscuits were all crunchy. But we ate that meal like it was a five-star meal. We tore everything up. And I remember one night we were sleeping in the room. It was probably 10 or 11. And we were watching Roseanne. It was late at night. So any step or any kind of noise in the house, it echoed through the whole apartment. So this night we were watching TV in the bedroom over. You could see it. And on the corner of our eye, you could see the bedroom light on, like it flicked on. You could hear that flicking noise. It was like so loud. Like I said, it could echo throughout the whole apartment. So it flicked on for a few seconds and then it flicked off. And I remember thinking like, I hope it doesn't come in here. I hope it doesn't turn the bedroom light on. I remember just sitting there like, being scared and sure enough, the bedroom light it flicks on. For a second, I remember just like grabbing the blankets and putting them over me and like thinking and crying, being scared. And this is like one of the first paranormal activities that we've dealt with. It's not the last, but it's one of many that I wanted to share. And so the light, it flicked on. We covered up. I was crying. I was scared. And one thing about having my sister, and I'm thankful to have my sister there because she always made me feel a lot better. She always comforted me in a way where, I wasn't as scared. So I remember that happening. I remember her like telling me it was going to be okay. And then a second later, that light, it flicks back off. And I remember just like uncovering myself and like looking in the hallway. And then I would say like 30 minutes later, here we heard knocking on the door. And it was our dad. He was knocking on the door. He was calling our names. So we got up and we made a run for the door. And mind you, any other night we would not open the door for him if he was intoxicated. Um, but this particular night we opened the door for him because we didn't want to be home by ourselves because we were dealing with that paranormal activity. We just didn't want it to escalate and get worse than what was already happening. So we opened the door for him and he had some relatives with him. So they came in, drank in the living room, had a party. And I remember we barricaded ourselves in my mom's bedroom, locked the door. And I remember just going to sleep that night thinking, like, okay, I could go to sleep. Like, I was happy that there was an adult in the house. And I remember just being able to sleep that night, not having to worry. And my mom came back. It was like that next day, that third day. She came back and we didn't go to school those days that we were watching our brothers. We were at home for 3 days, missed 3 days of school that week. And I remember a truancy officer came over, knocking on the door, looking for my mom. And I remember they told my mom, like, hey, you got a citation, you got to go to court. Um, your kids haven't been in school. Like, we're trying to figure out, like, what's going on. And I remember, like, we were all hiding behind the door, like, we didn't say anything. And they left, like, the letter on the door. But I remember, like, shortly right after that, we ended up withdrawing from the school and we ended up moving back to the res in Macy and continued going to school there. But, it was a different place, same shit. We were dealing with the same bullshit that we did living in the city. But one thing that I have to say about that time too is me and my sister, we didn't mind not going to school because we only had like two outfits each, like all of our siblings. And our clothes were never brand new. They were always from like Goodwills or, someone just giving us a pair of pants or a shirt. But we had about two outfits each. And I remember we would set those outfits in like rotation. And so we would like make sure they were mixed up so they would kind of, be different throughout the week. But I remember just being thankful and happy that we didn't have to go to school because every time I went to school, I always felt like shame. I always felt like people knew that we were poor and we didn't have this, that we lived in this kind of environment. And so it really made me close down as a child. I was real quiet. I was always embarrassed. Like I was always walking in shame. And I remember just going to school one day and going through the lunch line and when you go to I don't know if it's still like that, but when we went to school in Sioux City, we had to pay for our lunches. But if you're like low income, they like have a program that helps parents, pay for their lunches. But I remember this time my mom forgot to renew her application. And so I was standing in line with my food, and I remember they ran my number, and they were like, "Oh no, you owe us." Like, nope, you need to put that food back. And I remember one of the teachers was like, "Oh, here, you could have this milk. I bought it for you." And so that's all I had was milk for lunch. And that was like one of the reasons why I like going to school sometimes was because of the lunch. Like, okay, we're gonna have a good meal. And yeah, I remember that was just traumatizing as a kid too. And not being able to go home to tell your parent, like, can you put money on my account? Because that's just another burden for her. So I never told her. I just left it at that because I didn't want to add more problems. I didn't want to add more things added to her list of what she needed to get done being a single mother. And so I always just kept my mouth shut and just dealt with it and left it at that. But yeah, I was thankful that we didn't go to school. It got my mom in trouble. We moved back to the res in Macy, and the same cycle just continued on. And it's unfortunate, but that's something that kids are probably facing till this day is the same cycle over. But I know with me, that's something I'll never put my kids through. I'll never let them go to school and be hungry and come back home. They're always going to have a hot meal. And that's just something that I changed for my future generation. And I know my kids are going to do that for their children and so on. But I thought I would share that. And I wanted to jump forward and share another story. And I think with this story, it's really good. It's pretty sad and it probably bring back some emotions that I was feeling then. But this is the only way I'm going to heal is by sharing and telling and spreading awareness and going from there. This story takes place in Macy in West Projects, and I'm unsure how old I am during this time, but I do know that my younger brother CJ was probably about, I would say about 5, and the only reason why I'm bringing up CJ is because he's the important part in the story. But we lived in a one bedroom. We were given a one bedroom, and it had a twin size bed for a family of 6. But this is normal. Most native homes, they have multiple families that live in one household. And usually, one family's in each room. Or that's the way that I grew up, anyways. And then, so that was normal for us. My mom slept on the twin size bed, and we slept on the floor, wherever we could fit in. And so this day, um, my mom was drinking and she left, but there were still people drinking at the house. So my brother CJ was playing with a toy. Him and Castina both start fighting over this toy, just being kids and, throwing tantrums and crying. And I remember Castina just, you know, crying and screaming. And her older brother during that time, I think he was like in his mid 20s and he was drunk. And I remember him being so dramatic and grabbing Castina and like taking her in the back and separating her from all of us. And I remember he goes and grabs a stick, and it was like a metal stick, and I think it came from the broom. And I remember he grabbed that stick and start hitting my brother full on with full force in the back. And I remember my brother screaming and crying, and I remember just trying to help him and saying things to Castina's brother, and him just not listening and him cussing us out, calling us bastards and little bitches and just calling us all kinds of names that we didn't deserve. And I remember looking at my brother's back, and it was just like he was bleeding real bad, you know. He created an open wound, and I remember just feeling so helpless that day and not knowing what to do. And I remember me and my sister took our siblings and we put him in the back room. And I remember like we threw him in the back room in our bedroom, and I remember like locking the door or something like that. But anyways, I tried to like keep him out of harm's way. And so, which this was scary because Cassina's brother start chasing me and my sister around the house. And he just kept saying like, "Oh, someone's gonna get it. You're gonna get it." And I remember just being so terrified because, he was a big guy, like 6'3", like 250 pounds, and just chasing us full speed, like around the house. Me and my sister both go separate ways. And I remember asking my sister about this story. I'm like, "Do you remember when this happened? Like, where did you go?" I said, "Because I remember running downstairs, and my grandma used to have her washer and dryer in the basement. And I remember she used to have a laundry table, so I used to hide underneath. That's like where all the dirty clothes were. I remember being small where I could fit underneath the clothes and I just like fit in that pile of clothes. But that's what I did. And my sister told me that she ran outside and she was looking through the window and like watching to see where he was. So we split up, and I just remember being so terrified because he followed me. Like he chased me downstairs. I remember he had that stick and he was hitting everything as hard as he could and like saying he was going to find me and he was going to catch me, and once he caught me he was going to beat me up with a stick. And I remember just like grabbing my hand and like putting it on my mouth so I wouldn't make any kind of noise. And I remember just like sitting there, and then thankfully the downstairs it had a back door. So I remember he like ran back upstairs, and I was so terrified because I was thinking he was going to go in that room and start hitting my other siblings, and I was just going through all of these emotions. And yeah, I'm kind of getting emotional now just sharing it. But I remember running to our friend's house during that time, running to her house and knocking and banging on the door. And I remember her older sister answered. And I remember I was like, "Can you call the cops?" And I was like, "He's abusing my brother and he's chasing us around the house trying to beat us up." And I said, "Can you call the cops and have them come over there?" And I remember she was like trying to make me stay there and just try to be comforting and be nice in a way. And I remember just like being so terrified, like, no, I need to get back. I need to get back to my younger siblings, and I need to make sure that they're okay. Because whether I was small or not, like I would have thrown myself in front of a hit to protect my siblings. And it's unfortunate that I couldn't do that, when it came to my brother CJ. But I remember cops showed up right away. Like they were there in like 10 minutes. And I remember just being so thankful, like, oh wow, they showed up that fast. And then cops came, and it's like cops came and then my mom came at the same time. Like everybody pulled up all together. And I remember my mom like screaming and crying and wondering like what the heck's going on. And I remember like telling her like, Castina's brother had this metal stick and he was beating CJ like he was a grown man on the back with all his force, leaving all these marks on my brother's back, and to the point where his back was just bloody and just traumatizing. And I remember like the cops were in the back and like getting ready to put him in handcuffs and talking to him, seeing what's going on. And I remember my mom went and grabbed that stick, and I remember she started chasing him around the house and start beating him up with it. I remember that part, but I can't remember like when it took place because I know the cops were talking to him and trying to get his side of the story, and then all of that took place, and they ended up just taking him to jail. And I know they were talking to his mom. They were like in the back talking to his mom, and she was saying some things too. And I remember they ended up both going to jail. But yeah, my mind is not as sharp as my sister's. She might remember the order of how that took place, but I remember my mom though. I remember her grabbing that stick, and I remember her chasing him around and hitting him in the back with that stick. And but I remember the cops not doing anything to my mom, thankfully. Um, but I remember they took him to jail and his mom to jail. And I remember they were telling the cops because housing was there. I remember housing being there because they were telling housing, like, you guys need to board up this house. We don't want them here. They need to get all their shit and get out. And then I remember just thinking, like, where the heck are we gonna go? Like, we're homeless right now. We don't have nowhere to go. Nobody wants us. And I remember just like thinking, like, how hurtful can someone be and saying, like, you can't live here. And I remember they said, well, if we board up this house, because that's what they wanted, they said, can you guys board up this house? Because we don't want, them in the house. We don't want them in this house while we're in jail. So then that's when housing was like, well, if we board up this house, then we're going to evict you guys. You guys can't come back when you get out of jail. And then they were okay with that. They were like, board it up. We don't want them in there. Again, they were constantly calling us names while we were just little kids. And I remember just thinking, like, how can someone be like that? It just never met anybody that evil. And I remember the cops letting my mom know, like, Natalie, do you have somewhere you need to be? Like, maybe you guys want to grab your stuff and get going. He said, because we're going to board this place up. And they were being kind to my mom. And at this time too, my mom was bust up, but um, I remember we put our belongings in a car and we coasted it to Omaha Lodges at Grandpa Randolph's house. I really want to say thank you for listening and tuning in to my childhood traumas. Those are just a few stories from my childhood that I wanted to share. I wanted to start diving deep into other people's childhood stories, but I also wanted to give you guys a little bit of my background to let you guys know that there's a reason why I'm sharing this podcast and my stories. And that's because, I've been through it too. And I know that most of us have gone through childhood trauma, and it's something that many of us carry quietly. It's like a shadow that follows us into adulthood. And as a Native American woman, I see trauma not only as something personal, but something deeply connected to history, family, and community. Our stories are often shaped by generations of pain, boarding schools, displacement, loss of language, and broken traditions. These are not just events in the past, they live on in the way that we feel, think, and relate to the world today. Growing up, many of us are taught to be strong and to keep going no matter what. Strength is a valued part of our culture, but sometimes it can be misunderstood. Strength does not mean silence. It does not mean carrying pain alone. When trauma is left unspoken, it can grow heavier over time. It can show up as anxiety, anger, sadness, or even numbness. It can affect our relationships, our sense of identity, and how we see ourselves. And I know that's what I was going through, is just being able to not being able to connect to my culture because I didn't have that in my home. I didn't have that in the upbringings because we had other things that we were facing in our home. And a lot of people grow up with similar background as me, and they face the similar, identity, trying to fit in and trying to get to be more involved in our traditions by going to gatherings and sweats and smudging and things like that. It does bring us a lot closer to, keeps us grounded. And one thing that I wanted to mention before I end the podcast is just letting you guys know that it's always good to talk to someone, whether it's just a friend or a relative, even seeking professional help. That's always the best way to go. It's one of the important steps in dealing with trauma, because one thing you shouldn't be doing is keeping that to yourselves, because you don't want that to come out in a negative way. Because when you hold so much in, that comes out in arguing with somebody, that comes out in hollering at somebody, and that's just some something that they didn't ask for and something that you didn't mean, but it came off in that way. And that's how you're getting it off your chest and off your shoulders, is by reacting that way. And so it's always good to talk to someone about it, pick up hobbies to keep yourself busy, and just to free yourself, because you don't want to keep that bottled up. That's the last thing I would want for any of you. And I've been there, I've done that. It's not a good thing. Um, just find better coping mechanisms, and that's the only way that you're going to help yourself. Um, and the best thing is to know that when you're voicing your concern, just know that you are being heard. You're not being silenced. Your stories are nothing to be ashamed of or embarrassed about. That is your way of healing. And I am hoping to create that healing circle here, just so we're able to create a safe space. Um, but that's how I wanted to end this podcast. I just want to say thank you guys for tuning in. If you haven't yet, please go and subscribe to my page and like my video. And I would greatly appreciate it if you could share it on your socials. If you feel like my stories can resonate with any of your friends, relatives, or just anybody that you know, please direct them to my page. Um, Thank you guys for being here, and I'll see you guys on episode 3. All right, bye.